They called it worthless, until her dog refused to leave the cypress and started digging. The wind moved through the empty ranch like it had for decades, carrying nothing but dust and silence. Helen stood at the gate, a rusted key in her hand and a lifetime behind her. She had been given this land like it didn't matter, like it held nothing. But beside her, Koda was already moving, drawn to something she couldn't see, something buried beneath a tree that didn't belong in a place this dry. Would you have followed him? Or turned back like everyone else? The office smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. Not unpleasant, just tired. Helen Carter sat in a straight-backed chair that was a little too low for the desk in front of her. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers folded, knuckles pale. She hadn't realized she was holding them so tight until a dull ache settled into her wrists. Across from her, her sons were talking. Not loudly, not angrily, just efficiently. "This one's already in escrow," Daniel said, flipping a page in the folder like it was nothing more than a grocery list. "The north pasture, the equipment shed, and the irrigation rights. That's clean." His younger brother, Travis, nodded without looking up from his phone. "Good. That'll cover most of the taxes." Helen listened, or at least she tried to. The words floated past her, neat and organized, like rows of something already decided. She caught pieces: acreage, valuation, liabilities. The kind of language her husband, Robert, had used for years. The kind she had heard 1,000 times without needing to understand every detail. But today, something felt different. Too fast, too certain. She glanced at the chair beside her. Empty. Robert had always sat there in meetings like this, leaned back slightly, hands folded across his stomach. Quiet. Listening. He had a way of letting silence do the work. Now there was no silence, just papers moving, voices filling the gaps. "And the main house is already appraised," Daniel continued. "We'll split that once we finalize the buyer." Split. Helen's eyes dropped to the desk. She could see her reflection faintly in the polished wood. Thinner than she remembered. Hair more gray than silver now. 72 had come quietly, the way most things did. "And the Carter Ridge parcel?" Travis asked. Daniel gave a small shrug. "That one?" He flipped to the last page. "That's the old ranch. 40 years untouched. No infrastructure, no road access worth mentioning. It's basically scrub. Scrub." The word landed harder than it should have. Helen felt something shift in her chest. Not sharp, not sudden, just heavy. Travis finally looked up. "So what do we do with it?" Daniel didn't hesitate. He slid the paper across the desk, not even glancing at Helen. "Nothing. It's not worth fencing, let alone developing." A quiet pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Mom can take it." The room didn't react. The lawyer at the end of the table adjusted his glasses, made a note. No expression. Helen blinked. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice catching just slightly. "What did you say?" Daniel looked at her then. "Not unkind. Just distant." "The Carter Ridge land," he said. "It's the only piece left that isn't tied up. We figured it makes sense for you to have it. It's simple. No complications. Simple." Helen nodded slowly. "I see." Travis leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, Mom, it's not really worth anything. No one's touched it since Grandpa's time. It's just sitting there. Just sitting there." Helen let the words settle. She thought of Robert again, the way he used to come home late some Saturdays. Boots dusty, shirt damp with sweat. Saying he'd been checking on things. She had never asked too many questions. She trusted him. "Is there a house?" she asked. Daniel hesitated for half a second. "There's a structure, barely standing from what I remember. And water?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "Not that we know of." Helen nodded again. Her hands loosened slightly in her lap. "All right," she said. No argument. No protest. The lawyer slid a small envelope toward her, yellowed at the edges, like it had been sitting somewhere for a long time. Inside, something shifted with a dull metallic sound. Helen opened it carefully. A key. Old. Rusted along the teeth. Heavy in a way keys weren't anymore. She turned it in her fingers. For a moment, the room went quiet around her. Not really quiet. The men were still talking, papers still moving, but the sound pulled back, like it had stepped into another room. She stared at the key. Something about it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a question. Outside in the parking lot, a low bark echoed through the glass. Helen looked up. Koda. Her German shepherd stood near the truck, his posture stiff, ears forward, body angled toward the open stretch of land beyond the buildings. Not toward the road, not toward the people passing by, toward something far off, something he couldn't possibly see. Helen watched him. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, focused, as if he were waiting for something to call him. A strange chill brushed along her arms. She closed her hand around the key. When she looked back at the table, the conversation had already moved on. Numbers, signatures, final steps, everything decided, everything accounted for, except that one piece of land. Helen stood slowly. "I'll take it," she said. Neither of her sons looked surprised. Daniel gave a small nod. "It's probably for the best." For the best. Helen didn't respond. She slipped the key into her coat pocket. Outside, the Texas sun hung low and pale in the sky. The air carried that dry, familiar smell of dust and distance. Koda turned the moment she stepped out. His eyes went straight to her hand. Not her face. Her hand, where the key rested, hidden in her pocket. He let out a quiet sound. Not quite a bark. Not quite a whine, something in between. Helen paused beside him. "It's nothing," she said gently, reaching down to touch his head. But Koda didn't relax. His body remained tense, alert, still looking past her, toward that same invisible point on the horizon. Helen followed his gaze. There was nothing there, just empty land stretching out under a wide, indifferent sky. She exhaled slowly. "Come on," she murmured. But as she walked toward the truck, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been handed to her. Not by her sons, not by the lawyer, but by someone who wasn't in that room anymore. And whatever it was, Koda already knew it. Helen didn't say anything as she opened the truck door. The metal handle was warm from the sun, the kind of heat that lingered in Texas afternoons, even when the light had already started to fade. She slid into the driver's seat slowly, the fabric creaking beneath her weight, and placed both hands on the steering wheel without turning the key. For a moment, she just sat there. The envelope rested on the passenger seat, half open. The edge of it curled slightly, as if it had been waiting longer than it should have. Koda circled once outside before jumping into the back. Not his usual movement. Normally, he would settle quickly. Curl up, head down. Now he stood. Front paws braced against the seat, body angled forward, ears high, watching. Helen glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You're acting strange," she said quietly. Koda didn't blink. She turned the key. The engine came alive with a low rumble, steady but older than it used to sound. Like everything else lately, it carried a little more weight than before. They pulled out of the lot slowly. Amarillo faded behind them in pieces. Storefronts, traffic lights, familiar corners she had passed 1,000 times, each one slipping away without resistance. She didn't look back. The directions were written in Robert's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. Neat, firm, slightly slanted to the right. He had always written like that. Even grocery lists looked like they belonged in a ledger. She kept the paper on the dashboard, weighted down by the envelope. Highway 287. Then a turn she didn't recognize. Then another. The road narrowed. The lines faded. The landscape changed without asking permission. Fields gave way to open land. Open land stretched into something emptier. Dry grass bent under a steady wind that never seemed to stop moving. Fence posts stood at uneven distances, some leaning, some broken, most forgotten. Helen drove in silence. The hum of the tires against the road filled the cab. That and the soft, uneven sound of Koda shifting behind her. Every few miles he would let out a low sound. Not loud, just enough to be noticed. Helen checked the mirror again. "You see something?" she asked. No answer. Just those eyes, focused, waiting. The sun dipped lower as the road stretched on. By the time she reached the first dirt turn, the sky had taken on that pale gold color that comes just before evening settles in. Not dramatic, just quiet. The kind of light that made everything look softer than it was. She slowed the truck. The turn wasn't marked. Just a break in the fence line and 2 tire tracks leading off into the distance. Faded, uneven, almost swallowed by the land. She hesitated, then turned the wheel. The truck jolted slightly as the tires left pavement. Dust rose behind her in a long, thin trail. The road, if it could still be called that, stretched ahead in a loose curve. The ground shifted under the tires. Hard in some places, soft in others. Helen tightened her grip on the wheel. Koda moved again. This time he let out a sharper whine. Helen glanced back. He wasn't standing anymore. He was leaning forward, nose close to the glass, ears locked. She followed his line of sight. There was nothing. Just more land, more sky, more distance. "You're not helping," she murmured. But her voice didn't sound annoyed. It sounded uncertain. They drove another 20 minutes like that. Slow, careful. The road dipped slightly, then rose again. And then the gate appeared, old, wooden, set between 2 leaning posts that looked like they had been holding their ground longer than they should have. The wire fence stretched out on either side, sagging in places, broken in others. The grass around it had grown thick and wild, brushing against the bottom rails. Helen eased the truck to a stop. The engine idled, ticking softly. She stared at the gate. This was it. Carter Ridge. 40 years. She didn't move right away. Something about the place felt off. Not wrong, just not empty. Koda let out a low, steady growl. Helen turned her head slowly. He was already staring past the gate, not at the house. She followed his gaze. It took her a second to see it. There, beyond the overgrown path, standing taller than anything else on the land, a cypress tree, massive, out of place. Its dark green canopy spread wide against the fading sky, branches heavy and still, like they weren't affected by the wind that moved everything else. Helen felt a faint tightening in her chest. "That's new," she whispered. But it wasn't new. She knew that. Trees like that didn't just appear. Koda's growl softened into something else. Not fear, not quite. Focus. Helen reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the key. It felt heavier now, cooler, as if the air around it had changed. She stepped out of the truck. The ground crunched under her shoes. Dry, but not as dry as it should have been. That same faint smell lingered in the air. Damp earth, subtle, easy to miss. But it was there. Helen walked toward the gate slowly. Each step felt louder than it should have. The wind moved through the grass in long waves brushing against her legs. Behind her, Koda jumped down from the truck and followed close. Closer than usual. She reached the gate and stopped. Up close, the wood was weathered but solid. The latch rusted, but still intact. She stood there for a moment, hand hovering. Then she took the key, turned it in her fingers, and slid it into the lock. It resisted at first. Then, with a faint metallic scrape, it turned. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the open space. Helen pushed the gate. It creaked slowly. The hinges protested, but they held. The opening revealed the path beyond. Narrow, overgrown, but still there. Like it had been used. Once. A long time ago. Helen stepped through. Koda moved ahead of her. Not running, not rushing. Just certain. He didn't look back. Didn't wait. He walked straight toward the land, toward the tree. And Helen followed, because for the first time since leaving the office, she had the distinct feeling that she wasn't the one leading anymore. Koda moved ahead of her along the narrow path, his steps deliberate, almost measured. The grass brushed against his legs, dry at the tips but greener closer to the soil, bending as he passed and slowly rising again behind him. Helen followed, watching where she placed her feet. The ground felt uneven, not just from time or neglect, but from something beneath it. Hard in patches, softer in others. It shifted in a way that made her slow down, instinctively careful. The air changed as they moved deeper. It wasn't cooler exactly, but it wasn't dry anymore either. That faint scent she had noticed at the gate lingered stronger here. Damp earth. Something mineral. Something that didn't belong in land that had been abandoned for 40 years. Koda stopped. Just for a second. His head turned slightly. Not toward the house, not toward the open stretch of land, but toward the cypress tree. Then he moved again. Helen's eyes followed him, then lifted. The tree was closer now, larger than it had looked from the gate. It didn't just stand above the land, it anchored it. The trunk was thick, deeply grooved, bark dark and rough like it had weathered more than just seasons. The branches stretched outward in a wide canopy, heavy and still, casting a shadow that felt denser than it should have been. The wind moved everything else, not the tree. Helen felt it again, that quiet tightening in her chest. She pulled her attention away. The house came into view just beyond it, or what was left of it. It leaned slightly to one side, the roof partially collapsed, boards exposed where shingles had long since given up. One window hung crooked in its frame, glass broken, the curtain inside barely visible through the dust. From a distance, it looked like ruin. Up close, it didn't. Helen slowed. Something wasn't right. The structure should have been worse. 40 years of neglect should have eaten through everything. Wood rot, sagging beams, caved-in walls. She had seen abandoned places before. They didn't hold together like this. This one had. Not perfectly, but enough. Koda reached the edge of the clearing and stopped again. This time he didn't move. He stood between the house and the cypress tree, body angled slightly toward the tree, but his eyes flicking back toward the house. Helen stepped up beside him. "What is it?" she murmured. He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But his body spoke. Still. Tense. Waiting. Helen took a step toward the house. The porch creaked under her weight before she even reached it. The wood sagged slightly but didn't collapse. She tested it with her foot, then shifted her weight forward. It held. "Strange," she whispered. The front door stood closed. Not hanging loose. Not broken. Closed. The handle was rusted, but intact. Helen reached out slowly, fingers brushing against the metal. It was cold, colder than the air around it. She hesitated, then pushed. The door gave with a long, slow creak, the sound stretching into the empty space beyond it. Inside, the light dimmed. Dust hung in the air, visible in thin shafts where sunlight slipped through the broken window and cracks in the wall. The smell hit her first. Old wood, dry and stale, but underneath it, that same faint dampness. Helen stepped inside. The floor didn't collapse, didn't even groan the way she expected it to. It held. Firm. She looked down. Concrete. Not dirt. Not warped boards. Concrete flooring. Worn, but solid. "That doesn't make sense," she said under her breath. She moved further in, slow and careful. The room was simple. One main space, a table near the center, covered in a thin layer of dust. 2 chairs pushed in neatly, as if someone had last stood up and left without disturbing them. Helen ran her fingers lightly across the surface of the table. The dust shifted, but beneath it, the wood was smooth, untouched by rot. She turned slowly. A shelf lined the back wall. A few old cans sat there, labels faded beyond reading. A lantern rested beside them, glass intact, wick still visible inside. Not broken, not collapsed, preserved. Helen felt a quiet unease settle deeper. This wasn't how abandoned places behaved. This was how places behaved when someone came back. Her eyes moved to the far corner, a doorway, or what had once been one. The frame stood, but no door remained. Beyond it, a smaller room, darker. She took a step toward it, a sharp sound behind her. Helen turned quickly. Koda stood in the doorway, but he hadn't come inside. He stood just beyond the threshold, paws planted firmly on the porch, body stiff. Watching her. "No," she said softly. "Come on." He didn't move. His eyes shifted back slightly, not in fear, but in refusal. Helen frowned. "You've walked into worse places than this." Still nothing. Koda's gaze flicked, not at her, but past her, toward the back of the house. Then, just as quickly, back outside, to the cypress tree. Helen followed the motion, back and forth. House, tree, house. A pattern. She felt it before she understood it. Something connected the two. She stepped back slowly, moving toward the door. Koda relaxed the moment she crossed the threshold. Not fully, but enough. Helen stood on the porch again, the open air brushing against her face, clearing some of the weight from her chest. She looked at the house, then at the tree, then back again. "You don't like it in there," she said. Koda let out a low, quiet sound. Not quite agreement, but close. Helen stepped off the porch. The ground shifted slightly beneath her feet again. She walked toward the cypress tree, slower this time, paying attention. Really paying attention. The closer she got, the more she noticed it. The ground beneath the tree was different, not just from the rest of the land, but from everything she had walked across since arriving. The grass was thinner here, shorter, as if it hadn't grown the same way. The soil looked compacted, pressed down, even, too even. Helen stopped a few feet from the trunk. Koda moved ahead of her now, circling once, then again. His nose stayed low, close to the ground. He sniffed in short, sharp bursts, paused, then moved again. A small whine escaped him, not loud, but insistent. Helen watched him. The unease returned, stronger this time. She crouched slightly, reaching out to touch the ground. It was firm, colder than it should have been under the sun. She pressed her fingers into the soil. It didn't give easily, not like the rest of the land. She pulled her hand back slowly and looked up at the tree again. It stood there, silent, unmoving, watching nothing. And yet, it felt like it was holding something. Helen exhaled. Behind her, the house stood quiet. Ahead of her, the tree cast its long shadow across the ground. And between them, something didn't belong. She could feel it now. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to know this place hadn't been forgotten. Not really, not at all. Helen stood there a long moment, her hand still hovering near the ground where she had touched it. The soil beneath the cypress didn't feel like the rest of the land. It held together too tightly, too cleanly. Behind her, the house creaked, just once. A soft, shifting sound, wood settling maybe, or something else. She turned her head slightly, listening. Nothing followed. Only the wind again, brushing through the tall grass in long, uneven waves. Koda moved closer to the tree, not in a straight line. He circled, slow, focused. His nose stayed low, tracing something invisible across the surface. Every few steps he stopped and pawed lightly at the ground. Just a scrape, then a pause, like he wasn't sure where exactly to dig. "What are you picking up?" Helen asked quietly. Koda didn't look at her. He let out a short, tight whine, then scratched again, this time harder. Dirt shifted, just a little, exposing darker soil beneath the surface. Then he stopped, backed away. His ears pulled slightly back. Helen felt the shift in him immediately. That wasn't curiosity anymore. That was caution. She straightened slowly, brushing her hands against her jeans. Her eyes moved between the ground and the trunk of the tree. The bark was rough, layered with deep grooves, old and unmoving. There was no mark on it, no sign anyone had touched it in years. And yet, something here had been disturbed, recently. She could feel it without knowing how. The light was fading faster now. That pale gold had slipped into something dimmer. The sky still held color, but it was thinning out, giving way to the cool edge of evening. Helen turned toward the truck. "We'll come back to it," she said, more to herself than to Koda. But Koda didn't follow. He stayed where he was, standing near the same spot, watching the ground, watching the tree. "Koda." No response. She took a few steps toward the gate, expecting to hear him fall in behind her. Nothing. She stopped, turned. He hadn't moved. His posture had changed again. Lower now, not aggressive, but anchored, like he had decided something. "Koda," she said again, firmer this time. Still nothing. Helen exhaled slowly and walked back toward him. "You're not staying out here all night," she said. As she reached him, he shifted slightly, but not away. Just enough to glance up at her, then back down at the ground. That same spot. Always the same spot. Helen followed his gaze again. The soil looked no different than it had moments ago, but the feeling hadn't left. She placed her foot lightly on the ground where he had been scratching. It held. Solid. Too solid. She pressed down a little harder. Still nothing. Koda let out a low sound. Not loud, but urgent. Helen pulled her foot back. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." She stepped away from the spot. That seemed to settle him just a little. Not fully, but enough. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a dry, rustling sound across the field. Something loose tapped against wood again, faint, irregular. Helen turned her head toward the house. The sound came from there, or near it. Hard to tell. She watched it for a moment. The broken window shifted slightly in its frame. A loose shutter knocked softly against the wall, pushed by the wind. That had to be it. Had to be. Still, the sound lingered in her mind longer than it should have. "Let's get back," she said. This time, when she started walking, Koda followed, but not the way he had before. He didn't walk beside her. He stayed a step behind, looking back, again and again, at the tree, at the ground beneath it, at something she still couldn't see. They reached the truck just as the last of the light began to slip away. Helen opened the driver's door and paused. She looked back one more time. The cypress stood dark now, its outline sharper against the fading sky. The shadow beneath it had grown, stretching out in a long shape across the uneven ground. Koda stood beside her, his body angled toward it again, still watching. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she murmured. He didn't move. Helen climbed into the truck. The seat felt colder now, the air heavier. She closed the door and sat still for a moment, listening. The world outside had quieted. No distant cars, no voices, no movement except the wind. And then, that sound again. Faint, metal against metal, not from the house this time. Closer. Helen's eyes shifted toward the tree. Koda's head snapped in the same direction. Both of them froze. The sound stopped. Just like that. Gone. Helen felt her pulse pick up, slow but steady. "Probably nothing," she whispered, but she didn't sound convinced. Koda didn't relax, not even a little. He climbed into the back seat slowly, still watching through the window as Helen started the engine. The headlights cut across the land. For a brief moment, the beam passed over the base of the cypress. Something there caught the light. Just for a second. A shape. Flat. Low to the ground. Then the truck shifted, and the light moved on. Helen blinked. "Did you see that?" she asked. Koda gave a sharp, quiet bark. The first one since they arrived. Helen's grip tightened on the wheel. She didn't get out. Didn't go back to check. Not tonight. She put the truck in gear and slowly backed away from the gate, the tires crunching over dry earth. The cypress disappeared into the darkness behind them. But the feeling didn't. It stayed with her. In her chest. In her hands. In the quiet space between each breath. Koda lay down in the back seat. But he didn't rest. His head stayed up, eyes open. Watching the rear window long after the tree was gone, as if whatever waited there was still watching them too. Helen didn't drive far, just enough to reach a slight rise in the land where the ground felt firmer and the truck could sit level. She turned off the engine, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. No hum, no motion, just wind. She sat there for a while, hands resting on the wheel, eyes forward. The last traces of light faded completely, leaving the sky a deep, open black scattered with stars. Out here, there were more of them than she remembered. Sharp, bright, close enough to feel like they were pressing down. Behind her, Koda shifted, not settling, just adjusting, like he couldn't find a position that felt right. "You're not going to sleep, are you?" she said quietly. No response. She reached over and pulled a blanket from the passenger seat, folding it over her lap. The night air had cooled faster than she expected. The smell was still there. Faint. Damp. It didn't belong. Helen leaned her head back against the seat, closed her eyes, listened. At first there was nothing. Then, a faint tapping. Irregular, distant. Metal on something hard. Her eyes opened immediately. She didn't move, just listened. The sound came again, then stopped. Koda let out a low, steady rumble, not loud, but deep. Helen turned slightly in her seat. "Easy," she whispered. But her own voice felt thinner now, less certain. She didn't step outside, didn't go back. Not in the dark, instead she waited. Time passed slowly, measured in breaths, in the shifting of the wind, in the quiet tension that never quite eased. Eventually, the exhaustion settled in, not fully, but enough. Helen closed her eyes again, and this time, sleep came in pieces, short, uneven, light enough that every sound pulled her close to waking. When morning came, it didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, a thin gray light slipping across the horizon, softening the edges of everything it touched. Helen opened her eyes, her neck stiff, her hands cold. Koda was already awake, standing, watching. Not at her, at the land behind them. Helen followed his gaze. The cypress tree stood in the distance, dark against the pale sky, unchanged, waiting. She exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. This time her voice held something different. Not fear, not quite. Decision. She stepped out of the truck. The air was cooler, carrying that same strange scent more clearly now. The ground beneath her boots felt firmer than it had the day before, the moisture settling into the soil overnight. Koda moved ahead immediately. No hesitation, no circling, straight back toward the tree. Helen followed. The path felt shorter this time, or maybe she just didn't notice the distance. Her focus stayed ahead, on that same spot. When they reached the clearing, nothing looked different. The house still leaned, the grass still bent in the wind, the tree still stood silent and still. But the feeling, it had changed. Less uncertain, more present. Koda didn't pause. He went straight to the place he had been digging before, lowered his head, and began again. This time, there was no hesitation. His paws tore into the soil with force, pushing dirt back in steady, controlled bursts, not frantic, not scattered, focused. Helen stepped closer. "Easy," she said instinctively, though she didn't reach out to stop him. The soil gave way faster than it should have. Not loose, but not as compact as it had felt under her hand. Each layer peeled back in uneven chunks, exposing darker earth beneath. Koda dug deeper, faster. Then, his paw struck something, a dull, hollow sound. Not rock, not root, wood. Koda froze. His body stiffened. Then he stepped back, just like before. But this time he didn't circle. He stayed back, watching. Helen's breath slowed. She crouched carefully, brushing dirt aside with both hands. The surface emerged slowly. Flat. Straight edges. Not natural. A board. No, more than that. Several boards fitted together. Reinforced. Helen cleared more dirt, her fingers moving faster now despite the stiffness in her joints. The shape became clearer, rectangular, set into the ground. She paused, looked at Koda. He stood a few feet away, ears forward, eyes fixed on the opening. Not afraid, but ready. Helen swallowed. This was covered, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. She brushed away the last of the loose soil along one edge. Her fingers found metal. A strip, bolted across the wood. A handle, rust-coated but intact. Helen sat back slightly on her heels. Her heart had begun to beat harder now. Not fast, but heavy, deliberate. She looked around. The land was still, silent. No movement beyond the wind. No sound beyond her own breath. She reached forward, wrapped her fingers around the handle. Cold, colder than the air. She pulled. At first, nothing happened. The hatch resisted, sealed by time, by weight, by whatever had been holding it closed for all these years. Helen shifted her grip, pulled again, harder. A sharp crack broke the silence. The seal gave. The hatch lifted, just slightly. A thin line opened between wood and earth, and from that narrow space, a rush of air escaped. Cold. Sharp. Not like the morning air. Not like anything above ground. Helen froze. The breath left her chest in a quiet exhale. Koda stepped back another pace, his body lowered, eyes locked on the opening. Helen lifted the hatch further. Slow, careful. The hinges groaned as the wood rose, revealing darkness beneath. A space, not deep, but hidden. The air that rose from it carried that same scent. Damp earth, mineral, alive. Helen stared down into it, her hand still gripping the edge of the hatch, her body still, waiting. For something to move, for something to happen. But nothing did, only the quiet, and the cool breath of something that had been sealed away, now open. Helen didn't move at first. Her hand stayed on the edge of the hatch, fingers pressed into the rough wood. The air rising from below brushed against her face, cool, steady, carrying that same mineral scent she had noticed since arriving. Koda stood a few feet behind her, still, silent, watching. Helen leaned forward slowly and looked inside. It wasn't a hole, not exactly. It was a chamber, small, structured, built with intention. The walls were lined with reinforced boards, sealed tight, still holding their shape despite the years above them. A narrow ladder, metal, bolted into place, descended into the space. Not deep, but deep enough. Helen exhaled. This wasn't an accident, she whispered. Her voice sounded different now, quieter, more certain. She glanced back at Koda. He didn't step closer, but he didn't retreat either. Just watched, waiting. Helen shifted her weight and placed one foot onto the first rung of the ladder. It held. Solid. She tested it again. Still firm. Carefully, she lowered herself down. One step, then another. The air grew cooler as she descended, wrapping around her arms, her face, settling into her lungs with a strange clarity. When her feet reached the bottom, she paused. Let her eyes adjust. The light from above filtered down in a narrow beam, enough to reveal shapes. Order. Not chaos. Not decay. This place had been maintained, even if no one had seen it. Helen stepped off the ladder. The floor beneath her was packed earth, reinforced in places with flat stone. It didn't shift. didn't crumble. It held like something that had been checked, again and again. Against one wall sat 3 metal containers, sealed, clean, no rust eating through them, no signs of exposure. Next to them, a stack of supplies, wrapped carefully. Plastic, wax-sealed edges, items preserved with care. Helen's breath slowed. This wasn't forgotten. This was protected. Her eyes moved to the center of the space. A metal case, rectangular, heavy, set deliberately on a raised wooden platform. It didn't belong to the past. It belonged to someone who had planned, someone who had prepared. Helen stepped toward it. Her footsteps sounded louder down here, each one echoing softly against the walls. She knelt slowly in front of the case. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before touching the surface. Cold, solid, real. There was no lock, just 2 metal latches. She hesitated, only for a second. Then she flipped them open. The sound clicked sharply in the still air. Helen lifted the lid. Inside, paper, carefully stacked, bound together. At the top, a single envelope, her name written across the front. Helen Carter. She froze. Her breath caught, not sharply, not dramatically, but deep, like something had reached into her chest and held it there. She knew that handwriting, even before she fully saw it. Neat, firm, slightly slanted. Robert. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope. Not from fear, from something else. Something older, something heavier. She held it gently, turning it over, unsealed, waiting. Koda shifted above her. A soft sound, not a bark, not a warning, just presence. Helen looked up briefly. The light from above framed him in silhouette. His head lowered slightly as he watched her from the edge of the opening. "You knew," she murmured. He didn't move. She looked back down and opened the letter. The paper inside unfolded slowly, the edges worn just enough to show it had been handled before, but not often. She began to read. Her eyes moved across the lines, steady at first, then slower, then stopping, starting again. Robert's voice filled the space, not out loud, but clear enough to hear, measured, direct, just like he had always been. He wrote about the land, about the Cypress, about what lay beneath it. He wrote about the water, not surface water, not seasonal, but deep, clean, a natural underground source that had been tested, studied, confirmed, something rare, something valuable. But that wasn't what made Helen's chest tighten. It was the rest, the part where he explained why he never spoke about it, why he kept coming out here, why he let everything else be seen, and this remain hidden. He knew about the way things would unfold. Not exactly, but enough. He knew the boys would divide what they could see, what they could measure, what they believed had value. So he left them that, and kept this separate, protected, prepared. For her. Helen's eyes blurred slightly, not fully, just enough that she had to pause. She lowered the letter for a moment, looked around the chamber again, at the supplies, at the containers, at the case, then back at the paper in her hands. "You planned this," she said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, just understanding. She continued reading. There were documents beneath the letter, land records, registered. Years ago, her name. Not his. Not shared. Hers. Helen exhaled slowly. The weight of it settled in, not all at once, but piece by piece. The ranch, the key, the silence. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't abandonment. It had been waiting. Above her, Koda shifted again. This time he lay down, right at the edge, calm, still, as if whatever had been unsettled before had found its place. Helen folded the letter carefully, not rushed, not careless. She placed it back on top of the documents for a moment, her hand resting lightly against it. The air in the chamber no longer felt strange. It felt steady, like something that had been held in place for a long time, finally released. She sat there for a while, not moving, not thinking too far ahead, just letting it settle. Then slowly, she gathered the papers, closed the metal case, and looked up toward the opening. The light had shifted slightly, brighter now, clearer. Koda lifted his head as she approached the ladder. Their eyes met, and for the first time since they arrived, he didn't look tense. He didn't look uncertain. He looked certain. Helen climbed back up, step by step. The air warmed as she rose, the weight of the surface returning around her. When she stepped out onto the ground again, the wind moved through the grass just as it had before. The tree stood just as it had before. The house leaned just as it had before. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Helen stood beside the open hatch, the letter still in her hand. She looked out across the land, then back at the cypress. "You were never gone," she said softly. "Not to the land, not to the tree, to him." Koda stood beside her now, quiet, steady, and for the first time, not searching. Koda stood beside Helen, his body relaxed in a way she hadn't seen since they arrived. His ears still moved with the wind, catching distant sounds, but the tension had left his posture. He wasn't tracking anything anymore. He was settled. Helen looked down at him, then back at the open hatch. The letter rested in her hand, folded carefully, held close. She glanced across the land again. Same sky, same wind, same quiet stretch of ground that had looked like nothing the day before. But now she knew, or at least, she knew enough to understand that what she had been given wasn't random. It had been chosen, prepared. She closed the hatch slowly, lowering it back into place. The wood settled with a dull, final sound, sealing the chamber again. Not hidden this time, just contained. Koda watched her do it, then turned his head toward the horizon. Not toward the house, not toward the tree. Outward. Helen followed his gaze. For the first time, she saw the land differently. Not empty, not forgotten. Just quiet. She stood there a long moment, letting the feeling settle into something she could hold. Then she turned back toward the truck. "We need to talk to someone," she said. Her voice was calm now, steady, not rushed, not uncertain, just clear. The town was smaller than she expected. It sat about 30 miles from the ranch, tucked between stretches of dry land that looked no different from everything else she had driven through. A gas station, a diner, a hardware store with a faded sign, and a small office near the edge of town with a wooden plaque beside the door. West County Geological Services. Helen parked slowly. Koda stayed in the back seat, watching her through the rearview mirror. "I'll be right back," she said. He didn't whine this time, didn't shift, just watched. Helen stepped out, and walked toward the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Not old like the office in Amarillo, just lived in. A desk sat near the front, cluttered but organized in a way that made sense to whoever worked there. A man looked up as she entered. Mid-50s, maybe. Sun-worn skin, glasses resting low on his nose. He set down the pen in his hand and leaned back slightly. "Afternoon," he said. Helen nodded. "Afternoon." There was a pause, the kind that usually led to small talk. But Helen didn't start with that. "I have a property," she said. The man's expression shifted slightly. "Most people do." Helen gave a small, almost apologetic breath. "It's outside Carter Ridge, old ranch. Been sitting for a long time." The man sat up a little straighter. "Carter Ridge?" he repeated. Helen nodded. His eyes moved briefly, like he was placing something. "That land's been off the map for years," he said. "Nobody's brought it up in a long time." Helen reached into her coat pocket and pulled out one of the documents from the metal case. Not the letter. Something else. A report. She placed it carefully on the desk. The man leaned forward, adjusted his glasses. His expression changed again, this time slower, more focused. He picked up the paper, read the first few lines, then stopped, looked up at her. "Where did you get this?" "My husband," Helen said. "He passed recently." The man looked back down at the document. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the page. "This is recent," he said. "Not 40 years old. This was done. Not long ago." Helen nodded. "He kept going out there," she said. "I didn't know why." The man flipped to another page, then another. His movements grew more deliberate, measured, careful. "This isn't surface water," he said slowly. "I didn't think it was." "No," he murmured. "This is something else." He set the paper down flat on the desk, took a breath, then looked directly at her. "Do you understand what you're sitting on?" Helen held his gaze. "No," she said honestly, "but I think I'm starting to." The man nodded once, leaning back in his chair again. "There's an underground source under that land," he said. "Not seasonal, not runoff, something deeper. Clean enough to test at a high standard if this report holds." Helen didn't respond. She just listened. "That kind of source," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "It doesn't just show up, and it doesn't just sit there unnoticed unless someone's keeping it that way." Helen's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the desk. "He was keeping it," she said. The man nodded again. "Looks like it." There was a quiet stretch between them. No rush, no pressure. Just the weight of something settling into place. "What does it mean?" Helen asked finally. The man leaned forward again, rested his arms on the desk. "It means," he said slowly, "that land isn't empty." He tapped the document lightly. Not even close. Helen felt something shift inside her. Not surprise. That had already passed. This was something else. Confirmation. The man slid the paper back toward her. "If you want to move forward with this," he said, "you'll need full verification, testing, legal work. There's a process." Helen nodded. "I figured." He hesitated, then added, "But if this holds, you're looking at something people don't walk away from." Helen picked up the document, folded it carefully, placed it back into her coat. She stood. "Thank you," she said. The man gave a small nod. "You came at the right time," he replied. Helen paused at the door, then turned back slightly. "Or maybe," she said quietly, "I came when I was supposed to." The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. Helen walked back to the truck, opened the door. Koda lifted his head immediately. She climbed in and sat for a moment without starting the engine. Her hands rested in her lap. The letter pressed gently against her coat. Koda leaned forward slightly. Not tense, just present. Helen looked at him. "You knew it wasn't nothing," she said. He blinked slowly, then settled back again. She turned the key. The engine started. Steady, familiar. As she pulled away from the small office, the town slipped past her in quiet pieces. The same buildings, the same roads, but they didn't feel the same anymore. Because now, she knew, the land wasn't empty. It never had been. And whatever had been waiting beneath that cypress tree had been waiting for her. The drive back felt shorter, not because the road had changed, but because Helen wasn't watching it the same way anymore. The land stretched out on both sides, dry and quiet, the wind brushing across it in long, steady waves. Yesterday, it had felt empty. Today, it didn't. Koda lay in the back seat, head resting between his paws. His eyes were open, but calm now. No tension. No searching. Just there. Helen kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly against her coat pocket, where the folded documents pressed gently against her side. She didn't rush, didn't push the truck harder than it needed. There was no urgency in her anymore, just movement. When she reached the ranch, the cypress stood where it had always been, still, unmoving. Its shadow stretched longer now as the afternoon light began to tilt. Helen parked near the gate this time. She didn't drive all the way in. Not yet. She stepped out slowly. The air met her the same way it had before. But she noticed something different. She wasn't bracing against it anymore. She walked through the gate without hesitation. Koda followed, close at her side. They moved toward the tree together. No circling this time. No hesitation. Just a straight path. When they reached it, Helen stopped, looked down at the ground. The hatch was covered again, just as she had left it. Invisible unless you knew where to look. She nodded slightly. "Good," she murmured. Koda moved past her and lay down in the shade, right at the edge of where he had been digging. But he didn't touch the ground this time. He didn't need to. Helen stood there for a moment longer, then turned. The house still waited behind her, leaning, quiet, unchanged. She walked toward it slowly, each step measured, each sound clear. The boards creaked under her weight again as she stepped onto the porch. The door stood open where she had left it. Inside, the same dim light filtered through the broken window. The same dust hung in the air. But it didn't feel as heavy now. Helen stepped inside. The table, the chairs, the shelf. Everything in its place. She walked to the center of the room and stopped, listened. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was just quiet. She turned slowly, taking it in again, then nodded to herself. "I can fix this," she said. Not loudly, not as a declaration, just a fact. Outside, the wind shifted. A soft sound followed. Then, her phone rang. Helen froze. The sound felt out of place here. Sharp, modern, breaking through something older. She reached into her pocket slowly and pulled it out. The screen lit up. Daniel. She stared at the name for a second, then answered. Helen, he said immediately, his voice tight, controlled. Where are you? She didn't answer right away. At the ranch, she said finally. There was a pause. Then, you went out there already? Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. We need to talk, he said. Helen leaned slightly against the table. About the division. There's nothing to talk about, she replied. His tone shifted. Not louder, but sharper. There's more to that land than we thought. Helen's eyes moved toward the open doorway. Toward the Cypress. What made you think that? She asked. I've been going through Dad's files, he said. There are reports, old ones, incomplete, but enough to show there might be something there. Water. Maybe more. Helen didn't speak. We didn't know, he added quickly. If we had, this would have been handled differently. Handled differently. The words settled slowly. Differently how? She asked. Daniel exhaled. You know what I mean. We need to revisit the distribution. Make it fair. Helen let the silence stretch. She could hear him breathing on the other end. Waiting. Calculating. I see, she said. You understand, right? He pressed. This changes things. Helen looked around the room again. At the table. At the shelf. At the quiet space that had held itself together for years without anyone noticing. No, she said. Daniel paused. What do you mean, no? I mean, Helen said, her voice steady now. Nothing has changed. There was a shift in his breathing. Helen, the land was given to me, she continued. You made that decision. That was before we knew. You knew enough, she said quietly. The line went still. Helen didn't raise her voice, didn't rush. You looked at it, she went on, and decided it wasn't worth anything. That's not the point. It is now. Another pause. Longer. Tighter. We're trying to do the right thing here, Daniel said finally. Helen almost smiled. Not out of humor. Out of recognition. The right thing would have been different yesterday, she said. No answer came immediately. When it did, it sounded thinner. We'll talk about this in person. You can come out here if you want, Helen replied. But I'm not leaving. The words settled into the space between them. Final. Clear. Daniel didn't respond. The line went quiet. Then, the call ended. Helen lowered the phone slowly. Her hand didn't shake. Her chest didn't tighten. She just stood there. Koda appeared in the doorway. He had gotten up at some point. Now he stood watching her. Not alert. Not tense, just present. Helen looked at him. They'll come, she said. Koda blinked once, then stepped inside. This time, he crossed the threshold. No hesitation. No pause. He walked past her and settled near the center of the room, lowering himself onto the floor with a quiet, controlled movement. Helen watched him. A small breath left her. Guess it's different now, she murmured. Koda rested his head on his paws. Calm. Still. As if whatever had kept him out before was gone. Helen walked to the doorway and looked out again. The cypress stood in the distance, unchanged, unmoving, but no longer holding something hidden from her. Now it was simply part of the land, and the land was hers. She stood there a long time, not waiting, not wondering, just standing. As the light shifted slowly across the ground, and the wind moved through the grass, and everything settled into place. The next morning came quietly. No rush, no urgency, just light easing its way across the land, soft at first, then steady. Helen woke in the truck before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. For a moment, she didn't move. She just listened. No tapping, no distant metal, only the wind. And something else. Birds. Faint at first, then clearer as the light grew stronger. Helen sat up slowly, her joints stiff but manageable. She pulled the blanket from her lap and folded it carefully before setting it aside. Koda was already awake. He stood outside the truck, just beyond the hood, facing the ranch. His posture was calm, balanced, his tail resting low but not tense, waiting. Helen stepped out and joined him. "Morning," she said quietly. He glanced at her, then back at the land. She followed his gaze. The ranch didn't look abandoned this morning. It looked unfinished, like something paused halfway through a sentence. Helen walked through the gate again. This time she didn't hesitate. The path felt familiar now. Not easy, but known. Koda moved ahead of her, not rushing, just leading in a steady line toward the house. The cypress stood to their right, its shadow shorter now in the early light. Helen glanced at it, then kept walking. They reached the house. Helen stepped onto the porch again, the boards creaking beneath her weight. She paused at the doorway, looking inside. Same room, same stillness, but it didn't feel closed off anymore. She stepped in. Koda followed without hesitation. That alone made her pause. She looked down at him. "You're staying now," she murmured. He walked past her, nose low, moving through the room as if mapping it out for the first time. He sniffed along the edges of the floor, paused near the table, then settled near the back wall. Not guarding, not searching, just present. Helen nodded slightly. "All right," she said. "Then we start here." The first hour passed in small movements. She opened windows that hadn't been opened in decades. The frames resisted, then gave with a sharp crack of old wood releasing. Dust drifted into the air as fresh wind pushed through, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant soil. Helen coughed once, waved the dust away, then kept going. She moved the chairs first, carefully, not dragging them, lifting them, placing them aside. The table came next, heavier than she expected, solid, like everything else here. She wiped the surface with an old cloth she found tucked beneath the shelf. The dust came away in uneven streaks, revealing wood that had darkened with age but hadn't weakened. "That's something," she muttered. Koda watched her for a while, then lay down again. The rhythm settled. Clean, move, pause, breathe. Helen didn't think about the boys, didn't think about the call, not yet. She focused on what was in front of her, piece by piece. Outside, the light climbed higher. By midday, the front room looked different. Still worn, still old, but not abandoned. Not anymore. Helen stepped back and looked at it, then nodded. Good enough for now. The yard came next. That was harder. The grass had grown thick in places, tangled and stubborn. Helen found an old tool leaning against the side of the house, a rusted rake, its handle worn smooth from use. She tested it. It held. So she started there, pulling back layers, clearing small paths, not trying to fix everything, just making space. Koda stayed close. He moved when she moved, rested when she rested, always within sight. Occasionally, he wandered toward the cypress, pausing beneath it, then returning without digging, as if checking, as if confirming something still held. Helen noticed. "You're making sure, huh?" she said once. Koda didn't answer, but he didn't need to. By late afternoon, the land had begun to shift, not in a big way, but enough. A path from the gate to the house, a clear space near the porch. The grass cut back just enough to show the shape of the yard again. Helen stood at the edge of it, hands on her hips, breathing slowly. The sun sat lower now, casting long shadows across the ground. The cypress stood tall in the distance, its outline sharp against the sky. She walked toward it, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. The ground beneath it felt the same, firm, cool, steady. She didn't uncover the hatch again. She just stood there, looked down, then up, "Still here," she said softly. The wind moved through the branches above her, a low rustling sound that carried across the open land. Koda came to stand beside her. He didn't lie down this time. He stood, calm, alert, at ease. Helen reached down and rested her hand briefly against his back, then turned back toward the house. That night, she didn't sleep in the truck. She made a place inside, simple, a blanket on the floor, a jacket folded beneath her head. The air moved through the open windows, cooler now, carrying the scent of the land with it. Koda lay near the doorway, not guarding, just watching. Helen closed her eyes. The silence felt different here. Not heavy, not waiting. Just quiet. She slept longer this time. Deeper. No sudden waking. No sharp sounds pulling her up. When she opened her eyes again, the sky outside the window had just begun to lighten. Another day. Another start. Helen sat up slowly, looked around. The room held. The air moved. Koda lifted his head and looked at her. She gave a small nod. "We're staying," she said. The words didn't echo, didn't carry weight beyond the space, that they just settled, like everything else. Outside, the wind moved through the grass again, and this time, it didn't sound like something passing through. It sounded like something alive. Morning settled slowly across the ranch, the kind of morning that didn't rush. Light came in soft, stretching across the ground, touching the edges of things one by one. The porch, the grass, the worn boards of the house, the base of the cypress. Helen sat on the steps just outside the doorway. A cup of coffee rested in her hands, steam rising in thin, quiet lines. She hadn't thought she'd be making coffee out here. Not like this. But she had found a small burner in the truck, a dented pot. Enough to make something warm. That was all she needed. Koda lay a few feet away, half in the shade, half in the sun. His eyes were closed, but not fully asleep. His ears still shifted when the wind changed, when something moved in the distance. Present. Always present. Helen took a slow sip. The taste was simple, not perfect, but real. She looked out across the land. The path she had cleared was still visible, cutting through the taller grass. The yard around the house had begun to take shape again, not finished, not neat, but no longer lost. Further out, the cypress stood as it always had, unmoved, unchanged, but no longer distant. She watched the light touch its branches, filtering through in a way she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just shadow beneath it. There was movement there. Small, subtle. Life. Helen set the cup down beside her. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. She didn't feel the need to rush, didn't feel the pull of anything waiting somewhere else. For the first time in a long while, there was nowhere else she needed to be. Her thoughts moved slowly, not scattered, not heavy, just steady. She thought about the office, about the table, the voices, the way everything had been decided so quickly, so cleanly, as if her part in it had already been measured and set aside. She thought about the key, how it had felt in her hand, cold, unfamiliar, almost like it didn't belong to her. And then she thought about the letter, the way the words had unfolded. Simple, clear, nothing extra, just the truth, laid out the only way he knew how. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to hold on to it, not to replay it, just to let it be there. When she opened them again, the light had shifted slightly, the day moving forward, as it always did. Koda lifted his head, looked at her, then stood. He stretched once, slow and long, then walked past her without hesitation, toward the tree. Helen watched him go, not with concern, not with curiosity, just watching. He reached the base of the cypress and stopped, stood there, calm, then lowered himself into the grass, right where he had first started digging, right where everything had changed. Helen stood slowly. Her knees protested slightly, but she ignored it. She walked toward him, step by step, no urgency, no hesitation. When she reached the tree, she didn't look down right away. She looked up, at the branches, at the way they spread outward, steady and strong, holding their place against the sky. She exhaled softly, then lowered her gaze. The ground beneath the tree was still firm, still quiet, still holding what it had revealed. She didn't uncover it again. She didn't need to. Everything that had been hidden was no longer hidden from her. Helen stepped closer and rested her hand lightly against the bark. Rough, solid, real. She let it stay there for a moment, then pulled it back. Koda shifted slightly beside her, not restless, just adjusting. Helen looked down at him. "You did your part," she said quietly. He blinked, then settled again. She nodded once, then turned, back toward the house, back toward the path, back toward the place that no longer felt like something left behind. It felt like something found. The days that followed didn't change all at once. They built. Slowly. Helen worked in the mornings, clearing more ground, opening more space, each small section revealing what had always been there beneath the overgrowth. She learned the rhythm of the place, when the wind picked up, when it settled, how the light moved across the land at different times of day, what sounds belonged, what didn't. Koda stayed close, sometimes walking the edges, sometimes resting in the shade, always aware, always steady. People came. Eventually. Not all at once. A truck passing by slowed one afternoon. A man leaned out, nodding toward the house. "Didn't think anyone would come back here," he said. Helen nodded back. "Neither did I." He gave a small smile, then drove on. Word traveled, quietly, the way things do in places like this. There were calls, too. More than one. She didn't answer all of them. Didn't need to. The ones she did answer didn't last long. The tone was different now. Careful, measured. But it didn't reach her the same way. It couldn't. Because something inside her had already settled. One evening, weeks later, Helen sat again on the steps, the same cup in her hands, the same quiet stretching across the land. But everything felt fuller now, not louder, not busier, just fuller. Koda lay beside her, head resting on his paws. The cypress stood in the distance, its shadow long against the ground as the sun lowered behind it. Helen watched it. Not for answers, not for signs. Just because it was there. She thought about everything that had led her here. The loss, the silence, the way things had been taken, divided, decided. And the one thing that had been left, not by accident, not by oversight, but by intention. She let that thought settle, didn't push it, didn't question it, just let it be what it was. Her gaze softened. The wind moved through the grass again, steady and low. And this time, it didn't feel like something passing through. It felt like something that belonged. Helen took a final sip of her coffee, set the cup down beside her, and sat there a while longer. Not waiting, not searching, just being. Because sometimes, what looks like nothing at all is simply something that hasn't been seen yet. And sometimes, the things left behind aren't forgotten. They're waiting for the one person who knows how to see them for what they truly are. Helen Carter didn't feel like she had been given something new. She felt like she had finally arrived at something that had always been hers. And this time, she wasn't leaving. Helen stood beneath the cypress as the evening light settled low across the land. Koda lay at her feet, quiet now, his work done long before she even understood what he'd found. She looked down at the ground where he had first started digging, where she almost told him to stop. That was the moment. Not the letter, not the discovery. That small hesitation when she chose to trust him instead of herself. All her life she had listened to people, followed what made sense, what looked right on the surface.
But Koda hadn't cared about any of that. He followed something deeper, something unseen, something she had almost ignored. Helen let her hand rest against the root bark of the tree. The wind moved gently through the branches above, steady and sure. For the first time, she understood. Not everything valuable announced itself. Some things stay buried until someone is willing to believe they are. Koda lifted his head lightly, watching her. She smiled, soft, certain, because he hadn't just found what was hidden beneath the plant. He had led her back to something she had stopped trusting a long time ago. The quiet instinct. That feeling, the one that doesn't explain itself, but somehow always knows. And standing there with nothing but open land and silence around her, Helen realized something she couldn't have seen before. If she had walked away that day, if she had trusted what others said instead of what she felt, would she have ever known what was waiting for her?